Just make sure everything's working on the internet. I hope this works.
Does it take a minute for it to...
Buffer, yeah. Okay, it is now live. Currently working. Great. So, hello everybody. Welcome to the Be With Artists live Q&A with your host, myself, and Aishi Geek, which is a co-host for today and a very special guest who has come on board with a huge list of excellent questions about the recent project. So in light of finishing up the Android repair service, which I'm currently sprinting to finish episode 12, which is going to be big. It's the biggest episode I've done of all of them, which will conclude the first album of DG Unknown. And this means, well, the project is finally coming to an end. 2 years of hard work, look dev, and creating over 45 minutes of animation practically on my own. So it's a perfect time to take a tour, take a closer look, and I'm very thankful for your initiative, Aishi Geek, for asking these questions today. So before we begin, I would like to get to know a little bit about you as the co-host, and we can take a closer look at these questions. In total, we have about 11 questions, which will give you a full tour in detail of how we did this Painterly project. So, are you ready?
There's really not much to know about me. I am just a wannabe artist that loves using Blender and discovered Be for Artist when you did your Blender conference last year. So I was really inspired by the work that you've done, and I would love to learn more about that.
Oh, perfect. I'm glad that you got to see the Blender conferences. I was so nervous when I presented them last year.
It was great.
Oh, good. You couldn't have noticed, but my hands were sweating in both of them. But it was good.
No.
I'm glad you liked the project, both projects. So I'm ready to show you. So
Great.
the first
Well, I
things
do
first.
have, sorry, I do have, as you mentioned, a list of questions, and bear with me, and some of them might be obvious to some, but I'm still kind of getting my grasp over the details of Blender. So this would be really great. I really appreciate the time that you're going to take to do this. So let me know when
Pleasure's
you're
mine.
ready for my first question.
Okay, let's go with the first question.
Okay. Now, I don't remember where in the conference you talked about the scale of the brush size changing based on distance, but can you talk more about how you controlled the scale of the brush size?
All right,
Um,
great. Yes,
yeah.
this is called distance coherence, I guess you could say, because in 3D we have one object which is far away in the perspective like this. If we do a couple of pull it out to the back here, make another one, pull it back to the back here. If you're looking at my screen, hopefully it's
Right
streaming
now.
okay. You can see that scale or distance coherence is where the brushstroke remains in a similar size regardless of the distance of the object. We make another one even up closer here. This shows the exaggeration of the scale.
Mm-hmm.
So this is basically what you're asking about. So let me give you a quick little tour. We'll recreate this from the ground up. So
Awesome.
this is all done in shader nodes. So what you want is you want a shader editor. And I guess this is the final shader, so it's quite complex. But if we take a closer look, we can go into this one here. So first things first, I'm going to make a new sphere, okay? So I'm going to have one on the left, which is going to be my pinned shader. And the one on the right is the one that we're going to work on. So if I make a new sphere, Make sure it's here on the left, just to give you an idea. Well, I made 2 of them. So we can see which one are we going to work on and which one we're not. And which one we're going to replicate. So this is going to be the depth example. And this is the painterly. So in the painterly, I start with one particular node called the camera data node. So the camera data node, if we take a closer look, we can notice that it's all white at the moment. So what we want to do is we want to create a logarithm. So a logarithm, and then creates a floor. So this is basically the idea of how it works. Is we take the camera distance from the shader and we create, sorry, the view depth, which doesn't seem to show. I think we need to normalize it so you can see it. Over here. The floor, subtract, power, then divide. You should be able to see it. Why I can't see it, I don't know. Well, basically, I'll have to explain it because it's really hard to see. So when you have the camera data, you have the view zeta depth, which creates a gradient. And this gradient has 2 options, the depth and the distance. So the depth is basically a flat depth. So the further away that the plane is from the camera, the darker it gets. And the closer it is to the camera, the lighter it gets. And the view distance is from a point at the center of the camera, kind of like a sphere. So one is like a plane away from the camera, and the other one is like a sphere away from the camera. And this makes it so that we can see the distance of a particular view. If we use an algorithm, a logarithm, sorry, this is kind of like, I don't exactly know what it does, but it gives us the ability to see a bit better of what's happening. So I'm going to see if I can take a closer look. See if I can get the view. Ping pong. There we go.
I tend to break things, so you could just blame me if things don't work right.
Ah, here we go. Now I can see it with the divide. So if I take a look at the divide here, but this is divided by 10, so I'm going to just make it like this. So I've got 2 floors. There you go. Now I can see it. All right. So basically, I take the z depth, which is the flat version. I use a logarithm with a base of 2. If I change this, this is like the scale of the depth. So this logarithm kind of makes it able so that we can see how far or how close the depth of things are, right? And this, notice that it has different values of gray. This is how we look at it. So when we have a floor, we basically kind of now we can't see it again, and this is where we divide. So this division kind of like gives us, I think floor is similar to like a clamp of some kind, where it makes it a bit, it gives us a different value of the system. So this division is kind of like giving us the ability to kind of make it seeable in kind of 0 to 1 values. But this is how I set it up. I did this nearly 2 years ago, so it was quite a while, and so it's given me a little bit of a flashback to my development days. It took me a long time to figure this out, and I don't remember or know exactly. But I have 2 of them. So I have the first version up here and a second version here. And when I use these 2 values, this gives me the ability to scale a UV. So if I have the scale here and I can scale by a factor, notice that this gray value tells me to scale it by this gray value, like 0.5. And then this value here, I want it to scale to 0.65, and then 0.7 and 0.8. So,
Got it. Okay.
So if I load a texture, so let me just grab, for example, this brush texture. And if we take a closer look, this is the brush texture, right? Notice that in the background, if we look at the textures and take a closer look, notice the textures are all the same size. Wow, it's being scaled correctly. But if we turned off this vector, notice this is no longer scaling. But because of the distance into that scale node, I can scale the vector and it will change how that texture is being projected. And notice that it's like snapping, doop, 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 at different
Yeah.
scales.
Right.
So if I zoom in like this, notice that sharp edge of the scale every so often. It's like it decides to scale up by another point, another floored
Right.
value. So if we do this this effect here, we've got that texture, the one on the left, or the right in this case. So we got the texture, we got the scale value. We want to scale, for example, the UV. So just grab a UV, the UV map, the scale node, put that into the texture. And now we've got that function. So we notice that
That's awesome.
that's the
That's really
floor.
cool.
So that's the floor. That's the floor of that stepped
Right.
logarithm of
Yeah.
the view distance. And notice that it's because I'm using a division, I'm divided by 10. So like every 10 units, I guess you could say, it would scale by that amount. You can change it how you want. But that is the foundation of depth coherence or spatial.
Right. Well, we'll get into spatial coherence
A bit
shortly.
later. Yeah, there are like 4 pillars from the talk. I remember 4 or 5.
Right. But this is really fascinating. Thank you for sharing that.
But just to let you know, like it does get a little bit more complex. As I mentioned, I have 2 scales. So I have,
Right.
and I have an offset. So if I have a scale and an offset, if we just copy this here, just to give a clearer idea, I have one stepped logarithm here, and then I have another stepped logarithm, which is half a value off. So if you take a closer look, like this is from, notice the bottom edge here at this side. Then I have another one, which is a half a value over there. And then I have a ping pong. So if we take a closer look, this ping pong value by half means that I can now ping pong a value of that particular gradient so that I have these little gray values at the edges. Notice that
Nice.
I have this edge, right? And then I have
Right.
this gradient. So what I want to do with the gradient is I created a seam, I guess you could say, to mask over on top of the values so that I could use 2 masks together to hide that seam.
I see.
So notice that the one on the right
Right.
is snapping with a
Right.
sharp edge. I really didn't want that. That wasn't what I wanted. That doesn't look very natural.
Yeah.
So I used an offset gradient system to kind of hide the scaling a little bit using a ping pong mask with the same setup. So notice that if I zoom in a little bit, it fades out with a kind of a more organic feel.
Right. That looks really cool.
So that's you can do whatever you want, but the foundation is basically that. You need to get your z depth, get your logarithm, set the floor, divide it by the distance that you want, and then go. And then to create the mask, I used an offset with a subtraction of half to create the 2 values. And I used a ping pong with another subtraction of half to drive a mask. And this mask is basically another texture.
Nice.
And I use that to multiply and subtract to, well, this is actually a clamp. It's an inversion. And then I inverted it and used that as my system to drive the masking. And that helps
Very
me
cool.
to mix the two together, like this. And
That's
then,
really amazing. I really liked it, how it morphs from one to the other.
yeah. Another little thing here is like, notice the sharp edge on the UV here?
Hmm.
So this sharp edge on the UV, I don't actually like either. So sometimes I want to hide them. So inside of my vertex colors, if I go inside my attribute view, and if I select there in the properties editor, I have a number of color attributes. So I have the main color attribute, which is the red color, for example. And then I have a UV seam attribute, which I can have black or white. So I'm going to start painting in white. So go back into the render view. And what I do is I have two sets of UVs. One is a generated UV, and the other one is the actual UV space, which I guess which could lead us on to the next question.
Right. Which is, can you explain how you solved the issue with spatial coherence in order to keep the texture from getting disconnected with the camera? Um, I would really like to understand that because I get motion sickness and I would love to not make myself sick with my own artwork.
That's a good idea, yeah. When I started making this project a long time ago, I started with a thing called a pre-processor. So let me just load this up and show some images, some old images of the development. Would you
Okay.
like that?
Yeah, absolutely.
All right. So let me just load up the oldest ones. So my first ideas, this was the first image ever of the entire project.
Hmm.
And basically what I was trying to do is I was using grease pencil and I was using the system called geometry nodes post-processing. So I would use like a plane in front of the screen,
Hmm.
and using this plane I would use refraction as like an
Okay.
effect to look through on the canvas before I hit render, which was starting to look okay. But the problem was when I moved the camera, the texture would stick to that particular world. So, for example,
Hmm.
let me just load up a video to give you an idea. Here it is. So this is it was a little bit noisy, and notice that the blob paints would stick to the canvas and everything else would kind of morph
Right.
through it, which is an
Hmm.
interesting effect. But I thought if I'm going to animate the camera a lot, this isn't going to be the way. So I've
Right.
thought about it a lot. Oh, look, here's another example of the coherent depth of using the masking.
Mm.
More visual example as I was
Right.
trying to troubleshoot. So I needed to think of a plan B. So my plan B was this solution here, where I decided to use the UVs in actual 3D space to project the paint onto my fake canvas so that in the background you notice that there's a texture going on. And if
That's, I love that. That looks so cool.
so this is my solution of what I would call a spatial coherence. So let's take a closer look at what spatial coherence. There are two pillars with spatial coherence. One is UVs. So notice that if I
Hmm.
rotate around the sphere like this, it is stuck onto the sphere.
Right.
So this is a 3D space, and I can scale and model it and move it. This is based on UVs.
Hmm.
So same principles of texturing a 3D object. And the other principle is the principle of using a post processor. So for example, a post processor is the concept of where I use a 3D space set of volumes in the world to create some paint in the 3D space.
Got it. Okay. So it's like you're painting the volume uh, around the object.
Correct. So let me just show you the wireframe and zoom out. So this here, I have two versions. This is the complex version. So let me start with the simple version, which would be called, where is it? I think it might be in another scene. No, it's not. Okay. Here we go, post-processor object. So if I take a closer look, this particular object you can see is like a basic clump of icosphere. It's very low poly at the moment. And notice that the background is kind of like looking really funky at the moment. Right now the saturation is way too high. So if I just put it to normal, it should be okay. But if I move it onto the actual geometry, you can see that I have this kind of like a material that is transparent. And this transparent material is using the EV refraction to create a spatial sense of brushstrokes in the atmosphere. So one, I have the physical brushstroke, right? And the other one is I have the atmospheric brushstrokes. And these atmospheric brushstrokes, I designed it so that if I take a closer look at the material, let's just pin it. The basic principle of this material is this. Incoming geometry. So your geometry node with incoming. So if I unhide this, we have the geometry node. Add input, I think it is geometry. There it is, geometry node. And then I use a refraction BSDF with a certain IOR or roughness. Usually one is better, or doesn't really matter. And a roughness, notice the roughness makes it like blurry or not. So I just have a little bit of roughness to kind of have a little bit of depth of field. And then I use the shader to RGB node. This shader to RGB node practically turns in this transparency into a texture. And then I can use this with certain controls to drive everything else. So using the other techniques to get the brush strokes, which I'll explain a little later, I can use this principle of a refraction BSDF shader to RGB to create a basis of a transparent material of the scene to then build in a alpha mask with the same principles of the textures. And I use another system of Fresnel to create the alpha edges. I mix it all together to create this kind of alpha effect and create this kind of blobby material with the brush strokes that are semi-transparent in the world, which I can also like change the colors and all the saturation, all the lightness. You know, it's really good for like art direction if I need it.
Right.
It does have some clamping issues due to the system, but it's this is how I get my spatial coherence with the depth coherence so that I can stick the texture onto the brush while it is still scaling and onto the geometry and stick the texture to the actual atmosphere so that I can move the camera and still have a nice depthy feel of this paint texture.
Nice.
So spatial coherence
Really
has two
like that
principles.
look.
Yeah, like it took me a long time to get it, to figure it out, like as an idea. But I was in a little town, I saw the rain coming through the sunlight, and I walked across the street, and I could see the sun hitting this little Spanish plaza in the middle of nowhere with mountains in the background, and you could see the water reflect off the raindrops. And I thought, hey, that was a really beautiful effect, I thought, and it's kind of made me orientate myself in the world through the paint of the rain. So I thought this is what I call the sunny rain technique for spatial coherence.
Really nice. My next question is pretty detailed on like something specific in the conference. I'm just going to read it and then we can go from there because it's about texture. I don't remember if it applies to this texture or not, but I'll just ask the question if you're ready.
Yep, I'm ready.
Okay. So it sounded like for the paint texture that you used one material with a Voronoi that was mapped to the object normals, and that you also combined that with a Fresnel node for the edge, which you had just shown us. But I assumed that at the time that one of the shader nodes was a principal BSDF, but that doesn't look to be the case. But was there any node that was plugged into the color socket of that shader node?
All right, let's take a closer look here. All right, so this is the next principle of the painterly is you have spatial coherence, you have depth coherence, and then you have edge breakup. So edge breakup is the issue with 3D is that everything is super sharp based on the geometry, vertices and edges and faces. But with paint, I have a whole bunch of bristle strokes and the paint is bleeding everywhere because it's a liquid on a flat surface that's absorbing the paint to some degree. So this edge breakup is important because my hand is also not very perfect. So to do this, let's take a closer look, and I have this Fresnel brush breakup node. So the basic idea is I created a cheap Fresnel, which is where you take the geometry normal and the incoming geometry, you use a dot product, and then you absolute it. If you take a closer look, it's basically a Fresnel. It's the Fresnel node. I was trying to economize because I was running on a 1060, a GTX 1060 for a long time with 16 gigs of RAM for the whole project. For the first 7 videos almost, I did it on a very low-end hardware. So I had to recreate, and try to optimize even the Fresnel node a little bit. So you could use the Fresnel node now. So with that, I created this kind of edge, and
Really nice.
that this what it does is makes it black on the outside, white on the inside, based on the viewing angle of the normal and the camera. So notice that right at the camera in the center of the sphere, it is white, and at the edges, it is black. So what I need to do is I use the textures that I've created from the depth and everything and the normals and stuff, and I use a linear light on the Fresnel. So this linear light mix node with the clamp of the result and the factor, I add one into the other, and this creates this nice textured edge here. So I have the texture of the whole object, and I have Fresnel mixed together to create an alpha mask. And if I put it all together, you can see like you can mix a transparent shader with, it's going to take a moment to compile. Because it's the heavy shader. But yeah, this is quite a heavy one because it has all the pieces together. But once it's done, you have, notice the edge.
Yeah.
So for performance reasons, I use alpha clip, which is basically
Okay.
a Boolean transparency where you have fully transparent and not transparent. And using alpha clip, you can kind of define all the values in the shader, define at what point does the shader start to break at the edges here, and at what point it doesn't. So notice that just with the Fresnel and the texture, that is perfectly good enough to start breaking up the edges here to make it look okay.
Nice.
But as you can see on the floor, it doesn't work very well on the floor. Notice the floor disappears at some angles.
Right.
So when I work with my models, let me just load up a new instance, and I'll give you an idea of my modeling. So I'm going to bring up my assets library, which is probably very big. I don't know how many assets I have at the moment. But when I start creating my assets, let's take a look at this flat billboard. So I'm going to link it in as an instance. Take a closer look, turn on the wireframe. So when I look at the objects, you can see that it's like made out of multiple layers, made out of like a solid mesh, made out of this beveled meshes. It's
Mhm.
all very blobby. Or if I take a look at, where's another good example of a mesh or with a flat surface? There you go. So, or for example, this chair. Here's another chair. Notice that the mesh is very blobby, and it's kind of like remeshed to look together, and this blobbiness makes the material um, kind of respect the Fresnel. So here's like a monitor over here. It's sometimes
I see.
if I have like the modeling of this particular project is atrocious. It's terrible. Like these models are not good models. Like if I take a look at this character here, just sitting down, he's like is all triangulated. Or if I look at one of the principal characters, for example, Kirsten. So Kirsten, she is triangulated. Notice that the edges are all broken up, and you can see on her hair, for example, especially on the hair, it's actually made out of two meshes. So you have a solidified mesh underneath, and then you have, even on the neck here, you can kind of see there's a mesh inside of the mesh to kind of bring out the extra detail of the different angles. So I have two different Fresnel angles on the actual mesh so that you can see, kind of make the Fresnel work correctly. And the perfect example is with this bat here. So this giant bat, I really wanted it to work at all angles. So if I was looking up it down at it like this, if we take a closer look at the geometry, you can see that the geometry inside the mesh, there is some cross sections of the mesh inside. So to kind of bring out the kind of vibe, to make it work at
Right.
all angles. But the good thing
Really
about
cool.
this, of using Fresnel as my effect, is it's very performant, and I don't have to worry about topology at the end of the day.
Right. So you need to not have straight lines, it
Yeah.
sounds like.
Notice
Got it.
these nails, they're really thick,
Mm-hmm.
but at the final render, they're quite thin
Okay, right.
because that's the Fresnel. The
That makes
Fresnel is eating
mhm.
up some of the geometry.
Right. Really cool.
So I inflate the geometry quite a bit to make it work.
Nice. Now, I'm going to go into the next question.
Sure.
Um, you have some soft shadows in your project, and you mentioned that you use transparent light paths for from Eevee to project the shadows. Can you elaborate on this? I see that there's a soft shadows option within the shadows panel within the Eevee render tab. Is that what you're referring to? Or is there something else?
Right. So let me just quickly create a light. A sun lamp will do. And most of my rendering is actually done with sharp shadows. But what I try to do is I try to decouple the shadows. So if I take a look at this particular object, and I'm going to load up the light version. Just give me 1 second. So no more HD, get the light version. There it is. And also make sure the colors of this are okay. Where's my atom? There we go. Right, so I have this particular mesh. So notice the shadow is broken at the moment.
Mm-hmm.
So what I can do is, if I take a closer look at the material, what I have is the shadow caster and alpha switch to make the shadow break. So basically what I do is if I didn't have this system activated and I just have the transparency with no factor. So let me just mute. Notice the shadow is basically the same system as the Fresnel. The Fresnel is what's casting the shadow. But what I want is I want the shadow to be separated. So I can recreate the shadow in a different way, which I think maybe because this is the light version, doesn't show a good example. I had two shaders. One shader is the expensive version, the other one's the light version. So here we go. So notice that the shadow is completely different than the actual
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
object. This is done by the fact that I use a switch. I use a mask switch. And this is where I use the light path. So the light path node, which has a whole bunch of options. There's one called is a shadow ray. So in Eevee, we can use the is the shadow ray as a mixture, as a factor to define. One is the actual alpha of the object and the other one is the shadow. So the shadow ray has a mask defined by a separate Fresnel. So I have this Fresnel, which is a little bit different, and then I absolute it and I map range it to different values so that I have a different type of shadow value based on the mask. So the mask is normal like this, but the actual mask of the shadow is completely different. As you can see, it's like it's a different kind of system almost completely. And with that, I decouple the shadow from the shape of the object so that the shadows of the object with the clip mask become a bit more painterly, a bit more
Right.
of an effect on top of the other meshes. So if I move this, for example, onto the other mesh, and I make this world completely black, you can see that it's starting to affect the paint a little bit more
Got it. Mm-hmm.
in a different way than the actual object. Oh, here it is. You can see it a bit better here. So I have a paint texture on the shadows instead of the actual shape of the object to kind of imply that there are shadows instead of
Right.
real shadows.
That's really cool. Perfect. So my next question isn't with textures or shadows, but with scene transition. Um, I really like the way that you transition from scene to scene. Can you go into details on the method that you use to transition from scene to scene?
Is this the way that I do my editing or the way that I do some of my shots?
I think some of your shots.
Okay. So this is where things become a little bit. Let's take a closer look and show you how I set up my pipeline. So basically, I'll start at the beginning, just so you have an idea of my storytelling process, because this is part is more about the story.
Mm-hmm.
So if I go into my animatics and I load up, for example, which animatic should we work with? The second to last one, which is a relatively good one, episode 11. If I go into my video editing sequence, I have, let's just go to my animatic file. So basically is I have a script, and this script I wrote as a general idea of what I want of the general scene. And then I downloaded images off the internet. Some of them I generated, other ones I just found through Google, and I quickly edited them all together using a file called Fountain Unfurl, an add-on. So I can write in Fountain script, which is a standard format for writing scripts, and it automatically adds the text to the sequencer. Super nice with a click of a button. And then I time it to the music. So I have a general idea of what my shots are, and I have a general idea what my story is, and then I go into the next step. So the next step is called layout. So I've done the animatic, so then I go on to layout. So I go into episode 11. Let's go to an early version of episode 11, layout number 1. Sorry, episode 11. 11, song 12. It's all out of order. There we go. There you go, version 1. This was done in December. So now that I've loaded this up, I now have themes. And if I go inside my 3D view, and let's just use the 3D sequencer for now, synchronize it. I'll go into the scene view on the bottom right, just collapse everything. So now that I have that sorted, I now have my scenes more or less organized in new things. So, okay, so this is where it gets important. I have an animatic scene, which has all my scene strips together, and then I have each individual shot as a new scene. With that means I have a common collection for all of the elements on all of the scenes. For example, the same sky, the same set, the same lighting. I have a collection for my cameras. All of them are set up for my different types of shots and things like that. And then I have a sub collection with all of the information per scene. So I have one scene with the characters here, another scene with the characters here, another scene with the characters lighting per scene or per shot, and the effects per shot. So now that I have all of that sorted, I have all of my scenes set up with the correct cameras assigned, and each of these scenes will have a rough idea of what my cameras are. So I start arranging my cameras, and with this particular one, I animated my cameras to rotate. Let me just mute this for a sec. Sorry. To do it in the source scene. Playback, play audio, go back to the scene. So each one of my scenes, I wanted a camera that's rotating to the right. So rotate to the right, rotate to the right, rotate to the right, slightly upwards to show that he's inside something, rotate to the right. And I'm using cinematography as my guidebook. So at the beginning, and I have a general shot, an open wide shot, a semi-closer shot to show what's actually there, an even closer to shot, an American shot to show what's happening, or even a long shot of showing his full body. Another one just for fun. Then I wanted a close-up to show what he's actually thinking or doing. And then I do a cutaway of what he's working on. And then I wanted another kind of wide shots, an extreme shot to show the passing of time. And then I wanted to bring that out, another close-up shot to show some acting. He gets angry. And then he does some acting as I pull the camera out to show the relevance of what he's surrounded by chaos, really, and he's kind of frustrated about it. So the story is just basically he's in his workshop and he's kind of like not having a good time, but this is what he does. And the voice message is pretty funny, so he's kind of frustrated at the voice message. So I use cinematography, set up my scenes, set up my collections, link in the collections to scenes, and then I use the sequencer, the 3D sequencer of B for Artists to kind of help me set up my animation like this, and then I can start doing my animation. So if I go into the next version of this layout, things start to mature. Oh, whoops, this is the next episode. I've given you a spoiler. Right. Sorry, episode 11, number 2, 11, 12, 2. End of the month. Oh, it crashed.
Oh.
Because I update the version of the software, often sometimes things get a bit buggy between versions, especially with overrides. So just give me a sec. Maybe I'll load
problem.
the last version. So we'll skip a version. Episode 11, song 12, layout 3, February. Crash. Okay, I'll have to load up my spoilers.
Oh no.
That's okay. Hopefully next week we can release it. I need to work on finishing that. I keep forgetting which version for which. So episode 12, layout 5, yesterday. There we go. Okay, so this is where things get really, start to get a little bit complex. But if I go back into my animatic, into my video editing, you can see in my animatic that it's now a lot more complete. So I'll go at the beginning and I have the first shot, second shot, third shot. And in this case, if I go inside of those shots, I'm going to just keep the synchronizer off. And I take a look at the file structure. I have my cameras, I have my common files, and I have my scene file, that particular shot. And inside the shot, I have the lighting for the different parts. I have my animation, which is the spaceship. I have the set, like the extra props in that particular shot for that camera. And then I have my effects. So if I go inside my camera.
Right, and each shot is a scene.
Yeah, basically a scene is a location and a sequence of actions. That is a scene. And a shot is like a camera. That is your camera. Camera 1, camera 2, camera 3, that is your shot. Which camera? So I would label, as you can see, I'm labeling E12, episode 12, SO1, scene 1, P01, plano 1, or shot 1, or take 1, or part 1. You can use whatever nomenclature you like, but basically I have the episode, the scene, and the shot. So with this one, I have two shots, two cameras for the first scene, and I change scenes a little bit for another camera. Change scene, I have two cameras, 4 cameras on the third scene, then the fourth scene, a single camera, and I'm doing it like different scenes. And sometimes I can add cameras, remove cameras, depending on the story. You know, this is a very flexible system, but the idea is that a scene is basically a location. So to give you an idea, here is scene 1, and this is the same scene, but with a different angle. So it's the same spaceship or airplane, and it's coming in to land. So I have the scene of what's going to be quite heavy, and it's coming in over the camera. You can see in the distance everything that I need. So we just hide the effects. There we go. Notice the effects are the spatial coherence stuff. So that's my spatial coherence that I've added into the scene. If I put it into render mode, notice the background's got a whole bunch of like that effect. I have a, that's my spatial coherence stuff. The colors, everything with the lighting, still compiling. But these are my effects. So this is the actual scene. And then I have the effects on top, the atmosphere. It's just going to take a moment to compile everything. But basically, when I sort my shots out, I make sure that I have my parent collection for my common stuff, and then I have my sub-scene, my scene collections, and then my shot collections, all organized per scene. And then I switch my scenes when I switch my cameras. You can use Blender camera markers, which are really good, which is like Control B, set the camera into the timeline. So if I'm in my dope sheet, I go to marker and I can bind, or is it channel view? Bind camera to marker. Where is that setting? Sorry. Add marker, duplicate marker, add selection. Oh, sorry, it's in here. Cameras, active camera set, active. Hey, where is it? Maybe I need to select the camera. Selection. Oh. Maybe it's a hidden operator that I need to assign. But basically, you can Control B and bind the camera to mark somewhere. So I will need to select this, Control B it, and that will select the marker. I will have to report this because it should be discoverable, but it's not. Strange. So double operators here. That should be fixed as well. Oh well. Maybe it is in this menu. Nope, it's not. Okay, I will probably fix that in the future, but it is an operator, a hotkey, control B, and that will bind the camera to the mark. But I like to use scenes because it keeps things a lot more organized when I'm switching cameras. And allows me to also render with some lead in and lead out.
Yeah. Well, thank you for going into detail on that. I think you answered the next question, which was, if you can elaborate on your scene management process. Was there anything else that you wanted to talk about with your scene management process?
My only thing that I mention is that I do use the 3D sequencer a lot now. I can't live without it, where I can pin a scene to the sequencer and then I can synchronize it in the 3D viewport, which will automatically switch the scenes real time as I scrub the timeline. This particular feature, I can't live without it now, and it doesn't work in Blender. So that's just a little side note. It has saved me so much time.
We'll need to play around with the 3D sequencer. I haven't really used it much. I tend to export everything out of Blender or now B4Artist, and then I use DaVinci Resolve, but I'd like to get into more of the sequencer.
All right. So I guess we can move on to the next question as time is moving on.
So you mentioned that you only use one material for the entire project. And as a result, you use an add-on that overrides the materials. And can you tell us more about that add-on and if that's available for purchase?
All right. So basically, if I have this material right here, right? And just add in a bit more light. Like this one here. Notice that the color is gray. But if I paint it green, oh, oops, sorry, I have to go into the correct color attribute. And I paint it green, it goes green.
Right.
This is what I call the color overrides. And this is done using a color attribute node. So if I go here in the top, I have an attribute, a color attribute, and I can use the color attribute to drive a color. And this is basically, I get the color, I mix it in with certain things, and I use it to drive the different colors of the different aspects. I use a mask, I use a shadow mask and a color mask, so I could have two separate colors, and I put that together. So what my add-on does inside of the edit tab is basically, if I have a mesh that doesn't have, if I create something new, for example, this torus, and this torus is not ready for the painterly, what it does is it basically, I got to select the torus first. I select it, notice it has 0 color attributes. So if I click on the button here, all it does is it loads the material, applies the material, creates the 4 attributes that I need, and it adds this geometry nodes node group. So this geometry nodes group is basically a switch that has the heavy material and the light material for the viewport. And it uses a isViewport switch to change which one has the correct material. And it loads this material from a particular file. So here's a problem. This add-on works only on my computer. It doesn't work. It is not shippable. It's not a shippable add-on at the moment.
Got it.
Because
that sounded pretty cool.
It's basically, it just saves me time, like I have 100 objects. I have to create 4 different groups for 100 objects and apply the materials 100 times. uh, it saves me the time and it kind of automates that process. But the
Right.
problem is it loads the from a fixed path, not instead of an add-on path, from my computer. So if I put it on somebody else's computer, it would break.
Right.
So
Yeah.
does this mean that I will not make this available in the future? If you're patient, I will, but I have to design a lot of workflow. For example, add a preprocessor, add a create a
Yeah.
new, prepare an object, make the object blobby,
Hmm.
bake the materials. I have a lot of like automation things here in my action recorder.
Right. Hmm.
For example, making the UVs scale to the world scale and applying the painterly effect and automatically covering the seams and preparing the mesh and remeshing the mesh, baking the texture colors to the vertex colors if the model already has textures and things like that. And then the add-on that automates some of these steps. All of that I would need to make it a consumer product before I can ship it.
Right. All right.
Smart.
I was just curious. That sounded like a really cool add-on. Um, so I'm ready for the next question. Um, it sounds like each scene had their own lighting. Um, was there a common lighting setup that you used for each scene? And if yes, can you go into details on that setup?
Uh, sure. Um, Let me load up a scene that I really
Okay.
like. But this is after render, okay? So after the
Hmm.
layout, I do my renders. And then with my renders, I do my composites. And inside of the composites, that's where I do all of the fun stuff. So the last episode, the one with the person in this apartment, go inside of the viewport, camera. There we go. So to take a look at this scene here, I have this yellow light, I have this pink light, I have a green light, and I have the outside blue light, which is kind of like a sunlight with some fill lights. These are my common lights for the entire scene.
I see.
But now here's the important part. Each shot, for example, if I go in this particular shot, and I go into the next shot, I have a similar lighting going on, but depending on the subject, for example, here, I have a yellow rim light here, and I have kind of a light on his face to bring out his face, and I have different colors in the background. Or in this particular shot, I'm in the camera view, I have the light that is more green here, but it's in a slightly different position. I have more light on the actual subject here, and I have a spotlight onto the screen. Or in this particular shot, I have this kind of reddish yellow light in the background here, or I have more blue light in the foreground here, or I have my scene lighting, and then I have a per shot lighting based on the artistic direction that I need. What is the important part that I'm supposed to look at? The rim light. In this case, I turned off the green light, made the green light more reddish or pinkish to show that something bad is happening. And I added more pink rim lights to the left here, and I made the story come out in a slightly different way with that particular case.
Nice. Awesome. Okay, let's see here. I'm trying to look at my next question. At the end of the talk that you gave at the Blender conference, you were talking about color correction by looking at the canvas with the camera to project the texture.
That's
So
right.
can you go into details on what you mean by that?
Okay. So as you can see in this the scene, this composite scene, is I have a literal object and I have a texture on the canvas with some
Mm-hmm.
specularity.
Okay.
So this is a visual representation of what I do with the painterly. If I take a look at my files, so let me take a look at my render pictures folder, which is now currently a few hundred gigs, 300 gigs. If I go into that particular scene and that particular shot, which is 4:1, I have a sequence of EXR files, and this is the rendered output. So the rendered output from the 3D scene with the spatial coherence, the depth coherence, the
Mm-hmm.
edge breakup, and the color attributes, all of that with the grease pencil lines as well on the characters only. All of this is the raw render, which has
I
the
see.
normals.
Okay. Uh-huh.
And if I press play, you can see it's moving around. The 3D
Mm-hmm.
processor over here, you can see that I used it to make it a bit darker on purpose. Here in the background, I have another 3D processor, which is increasing the saturation behind him because I wanted people to look at him more. Everything else is kind of like got this transparent plane to show the fake depth to make it less saturated. Notice this got this hashed noise from a lack of
Uh-huh.
samples.
Right.
But all of this is the raw render, but this isn't the final render. So this is the first pass render, and then we go into the second
Okay.
pass render. So now that we have that rendered, I can go inside of my shading, and let's take a closer look at the paint. Make sure I have it selected. There it is. So I load up the textures into the actual material. So if I take a closer
Okay.
look, there's the material, E11, 4:1. That's the EXR sequence. And I use this with some color correction. So notice that this is the raw. I color corrected, boost the saturation and things like that. And then I add in some more color balancing and different things like that for different effects. And this is the end color result. And I use that to extract the light colors of the normals and the dark colors as well as a mask. So less than, more than, mix it together, bring it out together like this. So I have noticed that I have like this a mixture of the dark, light and dark textures, and I put that together into a bump texture.
Okay.
And this bump texture creates this fake paint bump effect. And I add
Okay.
that into a PBR material so that I have the final specularity and the paint effect on the actual canvas. And then on top of that, I use a preprocessor. So if I hide the preprocessor, notice that it is very clean. So this particular effect, there we go, with the
Nice.
lighting.
Yeah.
But if I turn on the preprocessor, this is an effect that all the hard work I did of trying to make the preprocessor actually did pay off, because now I have an actual canvas texture on top. So this canvas texture on top is a window. And this window is basically another advanced shader which has an actual canvas built into it
Nice.
with
Yeah.
a material, so that I
Wow.
can
Uh-huh.
apply the paint onto the canvas, but the canvas is in reality a window on top of the paint to kind of create a sense of it's on, painted on something. So I can change the paint texture, I can change the seed or the brush scale or the location. And I can
Great.
use this as a transition system. And then when I'm in my camera, if I zoom in a little bit, whoa, you can see that I have depth of field going on.
Mm-hmm.
So let me just grab that camera, change the depth of field, focal length. It's animated at the moment. But yeah, I can choose at what point I want to see the frames. And also the camera has compositing as well. So I have the final render if I'm rendering from here. I also do some gamma correction. Let's go into the viewer node. So I've done two things. I've done the canvas, corrected the color a little bit in the shader, then I corrected the camera colors a little bit, and then I added some camera effects. So if we take a closer look, the camera effects that I added is basically a vignette. So we've got the vignette, some camera noise. The vignette, sorry, is here. This is a lens distortion. So the edges, I have a lens distortion based on an anamorphic lens. So if I take a look before the lens distortion, it would look like this. With the lens distortion, I have it on like that, but it only does it on the far right and far left because it's an anamorphic lens. I use a vignette to show that the camera has a vignette, and then I add in some noise, camera noise. So in the light areas, I get more noise, or it should be, but in this case, it's the dark areas. I got it inversed by accident. Oh, no, it's correct. So if I take a look,
Okay.
see this white part? I add in the camera ISO noise onto that white part, onto the light areas, which is animated. And I use that as a consistent camera noise system for my lenses. So I made my painterly, but then I filmed it in Eevee again.
Right. Okay.
That is
Nice.
the concept of the two-pass render system to kind of make the paint feel like paint without relying too much on positing and still keeping my spatial coherence, my depth coherence, the edge breakup, and the colors, but projected onto a canvas to make it believable, which is was really fun because with these particular shots, I can animate the cameras for the latest Prisoners Gravity's album. I could reuse everything. So if I take just one of these, for example, and go inside the main view. Oh, it's the animatic. There we go. Okay, it's compiling. Give me a moment. But I could just quickly animate the camera over the canvas multiple times.
Okay. All right.
Still compiling though. There it is. All right, so I could just move the camera over the canvas without a problem. Any canvas, and notice that the camera is moving around with the effects of the compositor and recolor balance. This one's a nice one. Just move the camera with like a handheld effect, take a closer look at the paint, and do it almost without any extra hard work. So you can see all the cameras moving there.
Right. Well, that looks amazing. And I think you answered the question on my next question on the light pass. So we can move on to the last question.
Oh, great.
Which is, I'm not sure that I understand how you exported everything and then rendered from the compositor back into the sequencer. And do you mean that you exported the render to PNG files or image files and then brought those back into the sequencer?
Yeah, it's the same workflow as what you would have done with
Got it. Okay.
so here, for example, with these particular frames, I rendered this particular shot, for example, into 16-bit PNG. Probably should have used EXIs or whatever. And then inside of the sequencer, let's just load that up. I can go into my export folder. Export, the last step, POG exports. Yeah, publicity folder will do. And go inside of the to the C video editor. There we go. So basically, I just load the sequencer and work with different scenes.
Got it. Awesome. Well, thank you so much for going through this. This is really amazing, and I have a lot to digest. So this is great.
Good. I'm glad you liked it. And I guess this is a good moment to tie this up and say that, well, I've decided to do some rebranding. So I've become an official sponsor of B for Artist, which means my logo is now similar to the B for Artist logo. So I thought today was a nice day
Awesome.
to
Nice.
announce that. Let me just see if I
That's
can show it to
awesome.
you. Give me 1 second. Brand kit. Logos. So here's the new logo. And the brand
Very
kit
nice.
is. So it's I made this logo a long time ago, maybe 15 years ago. And the idea was to have a maple seed and a pine cone and a spine and a little seed in the center, germinating and sprouting. So I minimized it a little bit, and then I added the B for Artist kind of idea to make the logo fit in with the B for Artist logo to support and grow each other. That's the idea.
Perfect.
And also, B for Artist 4.1.1 also came out, so I highly recommend you update it. It's a lot more stable. And yeah, so thanks, Ashigik, for your awesome questions.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for going through them all. And thank you for anyone who sat through the entire stream listening to them.
Oh, I see some nice comments on YouTube. Yeah, Stein says very nice. Thanks for connecting. White Rooster as well, Slink.
Mm-hmm.
Also, Slink clarified that the floor operator rounds the input value down to the nearest integer. So it's basically, instead of a gradient, it snaps it into integers. So I have a fixed scale at certain distances. Got it. Cool. I'm really looking forward to see what you make, Ashigik, with your work.
Thank you. I'm slow going, but I'm excited to use Before Artists. I've been really enjoying it a lot.
I'm really happy you use it too. It always makes my day.
Awesome.
Small but happy, I hope. A small following, but a happy following. That's the important part.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Maybe in the near future, we can take a look at some of your artwork. If you would like to be a special guest once again, I'd love to invite you.
Oh, thank you. That'd be great.
Awesome. Okay, so everyone else, stay tuned for the next episode of Be With Artist 105. I will announce it hopefully soon. So thank you everyone for connecting. I hope you found this particular tour interesting, and I will talk with you later.